Welcome back, everyone. It is Michael here, and I am in Canada. So where better to film in Canada than in the wilderness? So we are out for a bit of a walk in the forest, and I figured I would take this opportunity to talk a little bit about a subject which is kind of related to some of the things I've been reading lately, as well as some of the interviews that I've seen, and just some of the conversation, which is around how did gold become money, okay? So I apologize, I may have to step around some mud here as I'm walking, so if that, anyway, hopefully it doesn't distract you too much. I'm on this kind of hiking trail. Anyway, so the question is, how did gold become money? And I think this is really important to think about because of the fact that it gives some insights into the future of money, the future of gold, etc. I know there's some people who are very much gold bugs. There are some people who, think that gold is the greatest thing, and the gold standard was wonderful, and it's this terrible thing that we came off the gold standard, etc. I tend to believe quite the opposite. But to understand how this works, it's important to understand how did gold become money in the first place, because I think that people have a lot of the wrong assumptions. And one of those main assumptions is basically this. They say that the hardest money wins. And so you want to have the hardest money. And so based on this, there's an argument that Bitcoin will win. Some people say that, well, Ethereum is going to be more hard than Bitcoin, so Ethereum will win, and so on and so forth. And I think this is fundamentally an erroneous assumption. So I'm going to kind of give a little bit of the history, which I hope will be interesting for you, and also kind of think it through from the standpoint of first principles in a way that people often have not done. And so hopefully it will be helpful. So let's dive into that. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. If you like the video, please let us know, give it a thumbs up. And if you would like help, the things we help you with here on this channel are relocating abroad, getting second residencies, second citizenships, figuring out the best global strategy for you, including how to pay the lowest legal amount of tax possible, how to protect your assets, do payment processing, very holistic, global internationalization financial plans, as well as the implementation of those plans. So we can help you with the actual putting it together. And so you can reach out to us, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. It's a link in the description below. You can book a call with me, or you can send a message to our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so that's that. Let's talk about gold as money. So in general, if we look back historically, of course, let's just talk about why we need money to begin with. And the answer is essentially two things, okay? One is to carry forward obligations into the future. So very simply, let's say that I'm in a rural agrarian community and I'm a farmer who is growing crops, okay? But my crops are not going to be harvested till the fall. And so I go to the carpenter and I say, hey, I need your help. And they say, okay, well, what are you going to exchange with me? And you say, well, I don't have this, but I can promise you crops in the future. And so we create a debt obligation. Some people will say that debt is bad. Debt is absolutely not bad. Debt is a natural occurring thing in the world. Debt can be abused. Debt can be, can cause lots of issues if it gets out of hand, but debt is not bad. So we say, okay, great. We've got this stuff where we're taking these obligations into the future. And so we need to record these somehow. And so we would record them on some sort of an IOU, okay? So that's basically what's happening with a lot of money, okay, is these obligations. Now, those obligations in that particular case are non-fungible, meaning that, the debt that you owe, if you owe me some chickens and, somebody else owes me some crops and somebody else owes me some medical services, these things are not equivalent, right? So they can't be easily exchanged. And likewise, if I'm in a situation where I am trying to transact with someone, and let's say I'm trading for furs, right? I'm here in Canada, and this was a really common thing, was the traders would come and they would trade for furs, and maybe they'd trade rifles or whatever else. Well, I have to know the price of everything in terms of the price of everything else, which is extremely complex, right? So for me to figure out, okay, well, if I trade you this many guns for this many furs, then how much food can I buy? It becomes quite a bit more complicated than being able to put it into one single unit of exchange, which kind of facilitates this. So the calculation is essentially n squared, right? Versus basically n plus 1. So that's kind of the complexity, or just n actually. So or n minus 1 actually, sorry. So n minus 1 versus n squared. So, dramatically easier to do transactions if we're in a situation that we have a currency that we can trade in equally. And this goes, by the way, for the debt obligations as well as for everything else, okay? That's kind of the reason for money historically. Now, so then you can ask, okay, well, what would we use as money? And here you can kind of start to think logically from the perspective of someone historic. So money was not an investment, okay? The idea was never so much focused on having more money, preserving value in any extreme sense, having that grow. There was no concern about inflation or something like this. What there was a, kind of steep here, there was a focus on being able to transact, okay? That's the main focus. And so what did this mean? Well, first of all, you need something that was very easy to transport, right? So if you think about trade, if I'm, for example, using cows as my form of currency, they're difficult to transport. So I'm not going to tend to use cows, right? Likewise, if you were to say, well, I could use soybeans, right? Well, they're perishable, right? So if I have wheat or soybeans or something like that, they're perishable, which means that I may not have the money when I get to my destination that I had when I started. So I don't want something that's going to be perishable. The next is I want something that is easily equivalent, right? So I can show equivalency. So for example, there was a period of time in some parts of the world where they tried to use seashells, okay? And what's the problem with seashells? Well, the problem with seashells is not that they're, more scarce or something. It's that you have a situation where the two seashells are not equal, right? So how do you know whether this seashell is better than that seashell or whether they're equal? So you want something that it's very easy to see. It's the same across the board. It's very fungible, right? Next is you want it to be easy to divide because, it's a problem to give you half a cow, right? Or to give you a third of a cow or whatever else. So you want something that's really easy to divide and do that. Now, as soon as you start applying these kind of parameters, you can say, well, this reduces what it is that we've got pretty quickly, right? Now, in and of itself, you are left with a reasonable number of options for things to use. You eliminate a lot of the periodic table because, all the gases are going to go away, all the liquids are pretty much going to go away. You're left with solids. Then you have some solids that were not discovered, like, palladium was not a thing until later on, etc. You run into a situation where, for example, platinum, although it's, something that you could in theory use, the problem with using something like platinum is that the melting point is about 3,000 degrees. And so it's very difficult to reforge it compared to something like gold or silver, right? So these were factors. But the question you might ask is, well, why gold and silver versus something else? And some people will argue, oh, well, it's because it's more rare. Now, if you wanted something more rare, you'd go with like rare jewels, right? For example, if you were to look at like red diamonds are extremely rare, right? That's not going to be something that you're going to use because diamonds are not equivalent, right? So we have that. The other thing that you want is you want something that's fairly universally acceptable. So you will notice that when, say, again, I'm in Canada, when the Europeans came over and were trading with the Native Americans, they weren't doing it in gold, right? That was not what, it was not universally acceptable here. So they were doing things like guns, right? That would be something that they would use as their means of trade. So probably you'd have ammunition and, whatever else around that, obviously furs from the other side. But you want something that is pretty broadly acceptable because you have to think from the standpoint of global trade, okay? So trade within your community, you can probably get away with various different debt obligations, etc. But if I go and trade in another country, let's say I'm traveling from, I don't know, Venice to India, right? This is there's no way they're going to accept my debt obligations, right? So I need to find something that is valuable to them, and we can kind of agree on some things that are relatively equal. So these need to be sufficiently plentiful, sufficiently, in other words, like if you're the only one who has that thing, it's not going to be very easy to do it. They had silk in the Byzantine Empire that they got from China, right? Silk wouldn't make a great currency because of the fact that you don't have access to it in these different parts of the world. So it needs to be available in a bunch of these areas. And so that means that it rules certain things out, even though those things might have some otherwise okay properties, right? The next thing that is really important to understand is that actually a lot of the currency was not the commodity, okay? So what does this mean? Well, if you were in a situation where you are the government is imposing taxes in their currency, okay? So if you had like silver coins or gold coins, the idea was not that you could pay in silver or gold. It was that you had to pay in silver or gold that was stamped with the government's stamp, right? And this has a lot of different control elements to it that are important, but it's worth noting that that essentially is a debt instrument, not actually the underlying commodity that's being traded. So then you can ask, well, why would you use something like silver or gold? And I mean, they've used other different currencies, or sorry, other different metals for this sort of thing, copper or whatever. Why would you not do that? And the answer is because you're concerned about counterfeit, okay? So from the standpoint of a government, you don't want people to be able to counterfeit your currency. You want to be the sole issuer of your currency. And it turns out that it is fairly easy to determine counterfeit if you have high purity gold. So we saw, for example, for a very long time in the Byzantine Empire, their gold coinage was considered kind of the universal standard. And the reason it was the universal standard was because they ensured consistent purity. And there was some debasement during a few periods, but not substantial. And you could figure that out very quickly. We kind of look at Archimedes, right? And the famous story of discovering buoyancy. And for those of you who aren't familiar, he was tasked with figuring out whether this, I think it was a crown, was actually made of gold or not. And he went in the bathtub, and the bathtub level rose, and he ended up running through the streets shouting "Eureka!" naked, going and stating that, look, he discovered that because the density of gold was different than, say, the density of lead, if you were to go and put it into, you have a certain amount of displacement, is going to tell you whether it's pure or not. And so there was easy ways like this to determine the purity or non-purity of these things, and that was useful. Now, beyond that, though, is you could, of course, do things to try and prevent the debasement. For example, they would put those little lines on the side of coins that you see. That was introduced, I think, around the 1500s or something. I might be slightly off on the dates. And that was to make it harder for people to kind of forge their own coins, right? It made it more difficult. And so you wouldn't have your coinage kind of counterfeited. It also turns out that in this case, a rare metal is easier to protect in that regard, right? So if you have gold and you're saying, okay, I've got that gold, I have to mine it, which is quite expensive. And so if the value of the coinage is not dramatically higher than the cost to go and produce counterfeits, the incentive is not to counterfeit, right? So this was a very important factor of the old world. And this, it turns out, there was not a lot of options back then for what you could choose. It was pretty much inevitable that you would choose things like gold and silver. The thing about it is that that's no longer true, okay? And so a lot of people would look and they would say, oh, you know, we moved away from gold. Well, why did we move away from gold? Well, first of all, because transacting in gold in a global world where you can transact in some sort of other fiat, and by the way, let's note that a lot of gold coinage was fiat, okay? It was fiat simply where the medium was gold. So in other words, I printed my fiat on gold in order to prevent counterfeiting, etc. And so if I have to physically transport that gold, say across the ocean, there's some stats on this, it was extremely expensive. You were paying a few percent typically in transaction costs, which is not really appealing. And so being able to transact much cheaper was much more valuable, which led really to more of the move towards paper money, more of the move towards kind of traditional fiat, and surprise, surprise, almost certainly massively dominated electronic money today, right? Electronic money is simply cheaper, faster, easier to transact in. And by the way, it's virtually impossible to counterfeit it because, you know, I control the central database. So if I control the database and you're in a situation where you can't just add zeros to it, well then, you know, I don't have to be worried about you counterfeiting. Obviously, the government or the central bank can essentially counterfeit. But on the other hand, you're in a situation where they don't care because it's fine for them to do that. So notice that it's not the hardness of it that is particularly the issue. It's not the fact that you couldn't issue more, but the cost of counterfeiting that was a big deal. And yes, it's true that the cost of counterfeiting in something like Bitcoin is extraordinarily high. Likewise for Ethereum, more so under proof of stake, actually. There's a whole conversation around that. But that's not the only factor. Now, it is also true that the transaction costs are quite a bit lower than, say, transacting in gold. And so that makes it better money in a certain respect, and will probably over time result in that money, some sort of electronic money, winning out. I don't suspect you'll ever have non-electronic money in the future. You will not go back to physical gold or something. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you're working at what will the money be, you want to think about it from the transactional standpoint. Like, what is it that people are most likely to transact in? What makes the easiest transaction mechanism? And yes, there are factors that go into there, such as, well, if I'm in a situation where the value of my money is decreasing really rapidly, then I may not want to hold it, and I may not want to transact in it. What I want to hold, I want to be able to hold what I transact in. That's essentially the deal. And but if I have something that I don't want to transact in, it's very unlikely to be money. So I hope that helps. I hope it gives kind of some insights that maybe some people don't talk about. I feel like people don't really think back to how things were historically and how that reflected on what we ended up, the decisions that were made at the time. And people just kind of have some weird ideas that get created and perpetuated because they haven't really thought it through from first principles, and so they just repeat what someone else says. So anyway, let me know what you have to say. Let me know what you have to say in the comments below, and I will look forward to seeing you on the next video.